You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250. This is where we remember events that took place 250 years ago this week. It's a short bonus episode from the American Revolution podcast to remember these important anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week, we remember the final Continental withdrawal from Canada on June 24th, 1776. After losing to the British at the Battle of Three Rivers, Continental Commanding General John Sullivan remained committed to holding Sorel and attempting some sort of counterattack. Meanwhile, General Benedict Arnold had seen the writing on the wall and had been planning to evacuate Montreal since early May. General Arnold realized that even if his commander did not, there was no realistic chance of holding Canada. The Continentals would have to retreat back into New York and try to prevent the British from establishing a hold on Lake Champlain. Arnold realized that his small force in Montreal would be cut off from New York if the British seized Sorel. He meant not to get trapped there just because the new commander had some delusion that he was going to recapture Canada. To assist with the retreat, Arnold had confiscated clothing, supplies, and just about anything else of value for the army from the merchants in Montreal. He promised them that they would be repaid and marked all the goods he packed up with each merchant's name. He then ordered an officer named Major Scott to oversee the transfer of the supplies to Fort Chambly. There, the commander, Colonel Moses Hazen, refused to accept receipt of the goods. Now, it's not clear exactly why. It could be that he objected to the confiscation of goods from his fellow Canadians. It could also just be because he hated Arnold and wanted to annoy him. Scott left the items along the riverbank outside of Fort Chambly. Of course, the unattended valuables were soon looted and disappeared. If Hazen's goal was to annoy Arnold, he definitely succeeded on that score. Arnold, who had already had words with Hazen for his refusal to obey orders, and who often regularly got into trouble for allegations of misappropriated property, was livid that Hazen had allowed property under Arnold's responsibility to be stolen. The incident would lead to a court-martial, but for the moment the Continental Army had to escape from the British, who were now bearing down on them at Sorel. British Lieutenant Colonel Fraser, fresh off his victory against the Continentals at Three Rivers, continued to move his brigade up the St. Lawrence towards Sorel in mid-June. Sullivan remained firm that he would defend Sorel or die trying. Meanwhile, Arnold was busy moving troops up the Richelieu River toward Lake Champlain, where his fleet, still on the lake, could transport everyone back down to Crown Point and Ticonderoga. He did a great job of transporting all the sick and wounded, as well as military supplies, back to safety. Arnold even had the partially built British ship that was still in the dock at Chambly disassembled and shipped south. While Sullivan worked on his plan to defeat the British, Arnold saw that the enemy could bypass Sorel and march overland to capture Fort Chambly, thus cutting off Sullivan's line of retreat. Finally, on June 13th, Sullivan sighted Lieutenant Colonel Fraser's advance forces moving on his lines at Sorel. Sullivan held a council of war, at which everyone pretty much said he was an idiot if he planned to stay and fight. Reluctantly, Sullivan approved the withdrawal and moved his army south in the face of the enemy back to Fort Chambly. The next day, General Burgoyne landed 4,000 regulars and field cannons at Sorel. Another 4,000 were on their way up the St. Lawrence River. Somehow, Arnold was back in Montreal when the British took Sorel. Carleton took part of the fleet upriver toward Montreal, but unfavorable winds slowed his approach, giving Arnold time to escape and make his way back overland through Indian-infested forests back to Fort St-Jean. At St-Jean, Arnold reconnected with Sullivan, who had destroyed Fort Chambly on his way south. The British moved slowly and deliberately, retaking ground but avoiding any possible ambush. As a result, the Continentals had time to remove or destroy just about anything of value. Among other things, Arnold burned Colonel Hazen's home, which Hazen agreed was the proper course of action. Still, Arnold must have secretly enjoyed that. Sullivan again called a council of war to discuss forming a last stand at St-Jean, but again his officers voted him down. They were in no condition to fight. The Army moved further south to Illinois, near the New York border. There, Sullivan said he would retreat no further without orders from a superior. Arnold held the rear of the escaping army at St. Jean. He remained on horseback until he could literally see the enemy approaching. He removed his saddle, shot his horse to deny it to the enemy, and boarded the very last boat south back to Illinois. By mid-June, the Continental Army encamped at Illinois, whilst General Sullivan wrote letters to everyone, trying to avoid blame for losing Canada. He sent General Arnold to meet personally with the commanding officer for the region, General Philip Schuyler, who was in Albany, to justify the retreat that they had done so far and to request further orders. Both Schuyler and Arnold agreed that it made sense to pull the army back to Ticonderoga and Crown Point and to focus on keeping the enemy from establishing a navy on Lake Champlain. Illinois was a swamp. The army was now not only dying from smallpox, but also dying from malaria as well. More than half of the 5,200 men in the Continental Northern Army were unfit for duty. There was no way to sail ships up the Richelieu Rapids, so British General Carleton would have to disassemble his ships, carry the parts to St. Jean, and reassemble them there. Now, that was going to take months. During this time, Arnold would build up his own navy on the lake so that he could prevent Carleton's march south to retake Crown Point and Ticonderoga. Schuyler also received word that Congress had already decided to relieve Sullivan of command. Sullivan would return to New York, and General Horatio Gates would take command of the Northern Army. This was good news for Arnold. He actually still liked Gates at this point, but Gates and Schuyler disliked each other, leading to more conflict and infighting that the Army really didn't need. Sullivan attempted to resign his commission, but was persuaded to stay and serve Washington at the Battle of Long Island. The Continental Army moved back to Crown Point and Ticonderoga. As expected, Carleton did not pursue immediately, but took slow and decisive action to recapture Lake Champlain. Both armies would have several months to prepare for the next offensive. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. For more on the story, check out episode 95 on the American Revolution podcast, which you can access at blog.amrevpodcast.com. And please subscribe for free to the whole podcast on whatever podcast platform you like. Thanks again for listening to this Revolution 250 moment on the American Revolution podcast.